Why some seniors stop praying, and how faith can change again after 70. Somewhere along the way, the words got quieter. You still believe in God. You still think about Him. But the prayers, those once familiar rhythms of morning whispers, table blessings, and nighttime thank yous, they don't come as easily anymore. And maybe you haven't told anyone. Maybe you haven't even said it out loud to yourself. But something changed. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment when you stopped. No declaration, no rebellion. Just a slow drifting, like a shoreline fading in the fog. One day you realized it had been weeks since you prayed like you used to. Or you did speak, but the words felt hollow, rehearsed, like writing a letter you weren't sure would be read. And maybe that scares you a little, not because you think you've lost your faith, but because it feels like your faith has changed shape and you don't know what to do with that. You used to pray out loud with certainty. You used to close your eyes and feel like someone was listening. Now sometimes it just feels like you're talking to the ceiling. Other times it's worse because it feels like you have nothing to say at all. No one really prepares you for that part of growing older. They talk about the physical aches, the memory lapses, the quiet homes. But they don't talk about the spiritual quiet, the tiredness in your soul, the disappointment that crept in after too many prayers went unanswered, the feeling of watching people you loved die with questions still on their lips, the ache of walking through decades of life and realizing that your conversations with God don't sound like they used to. And still, here you are, still believing, still hoping, still wondering if God hears you when you have no words. Still wondering if it's okay to feel this way. This video isn't here to shame you back into prayer. It isn't here to lecture or pretend to have all the answers. It's here to tell the truth, the quiet truth most people are too afraid to say. That sometimes prayer fades, that sometimes faith trembles, that sometimes even the strongest believers grow tired. But this season of your life isn't the end of your faith. It may be the beginning of something new, something deeper, something softer. And even if you've gone silent, even if the prayers have stopped flowing, God hasn't moved. He's still there. In the silence, in the ache, in the questions, waiting not for perfection, but for honesty. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about why some seniors stop praying and how faith, even now, even here, can still grow back. Not the way it was before, but maybe, just maybe, in a way that feels even more real. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There's no crisis, no big argument with God, no final angry prayer slammed shut like a door. It just happens, gradually, quietly, like forgetting the lyrics to an old song you used to love. Maybe it started when your body got tired. Kneeling became harder. Holding your Bible felt heavier. You'd fall asleep mid-prayer or get distracted or simply forget. Then days turned into weeks and the habit became memory. Or maybe the drift began with loss. You buried someone you loved, a spouse, a sibling, a friend. And in the stillness that followed, in the empty chair at the table or the long hours, alone, you found it harder and harder to speak to a God who had allowed the emptiness in. Not because you didn't believe anymore, but because your heart felt raw and quiet, and prayer felt like something you didn't know how to do in grief's language. For some, it's disconnection from the church, a community that once felt like home starts to feel foreign. The music changes, the pastor retires, or maybe you moved, and now you're in a new neighborhood, a new phase of life, surrounded by strangers in the pews. And suddenly you don't feel like going anymore. And when Sunday slips away, sometimes the rest of your prayer life does too. It's not always sadness. Sometimes it's just stillness. You wake up and realize you haven't prayed like you used to. You still talk to God here and there, maybe in short thoughts or soft thank yous. But the deep daily rhythm of prayer has drifted, like a boat untethered, floating slowly away. And the hardest part? No one sees it. Because from the outside, everything still looks faithful. You still say grace at meals. You still attend when you can. But inside you feel distant and ashamed maybe, or confused, or just numb. But here's the truth. You are not alone in this. There are more people than you think, faithful, devoted people, who've gone quiet with God in this season. Not because they've stopped believing, but because belief, like everything else, changes with age. Your silence is not rebellion. It's not failure. It might just be transition, a holy kind of unraveling, a deeper kind of searching, a soul that's ready to know God again in a new, quieter way. You've prayed for a lot in your life, for healing, for protection, for provision, for strength, for your children when they were out too late, for a marriage that felt like it was slipping, for a diagnosis that frightened you, for clarity, for peace, for a sign. Some of those prayers were answered, some in ways you expected, others in ways that didn't make sense until years later. But some just never seemed to come at all. You still remember them, the prayers you whispered in desperation, the ones you cried, the ones you clung to like lifelines, and the waiting that followed, long, lonely waiting, until finally you had to face the silence. That silence is heavy. No one talks much about that kind of weight, the kind that settles on your chest after praying for something for so long and seeing no change, the kind that wears down hope not all at once, but in slow, subtle layers. You start to wonder, was I praying wrong? Was I asking for too much? Did God hear me? Did he choose not to answer? Or worse, did I not deserve the answer? You hear stories of miraculous turnarounds, sudden breakthroughs, people being healed or restored. And while you're genuinely happy for them, there's a small ache inside you that asks, but what about me? That ache can become a wedge. Not always a loud one. Not the kind that makes you give up your faith. Just the kind that makes it harder to pray. The kind that makes your voice go soft, your words less certain, your hope a little dimmer. It's easy to say God works in mysterious ways when you're young, and life is still full of maybes. But when you're older, when you've lived long enough to see some of your deepest prayers go unanswered, it becomes harder to hold on to that mystery. And yet, in that same silence, in the unanswered questions, something else begins to form. Not always quickly, not always clearly, but over time the sharpness dulls, and you start to realize, maybe the unanswered prayers didn't mean God abandoned you. Maybe they meant something else was happening, something beyond the timeline you wanted, something quieter than the miracle you were hoping for. Sometimes the answers came in ways you didn't recognize, in a deepened strength, in the presence of a friend, in the resilience you didn't know you had. And sometimes the answer was simply this, that God stayed, even when you didn't get what you asked for, even when the healing didn't come, even when the outcome broke your heart. Maybe the silence wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was an invitation to see God not just as the one who gives, but the one who sits with you when you receive nothing, and still believe. For a lot of us, faith started out as something we were taught to do before we ever understood why. You showed up to church because your parents made you. You folded your hands before meals because that's what you were taught was right. You memorized verses, recited prayers, and checked the boxes that told the world and God you were trying your best to be good. There was a sense of structure, of safety in that. Duty made faith reliable, predictable. It told you who you were, where to sit, what to say. And for a while that was enough. But somewhere along the way, especially in older age, duty alone stops being enough. The structure you once relied on begins to feel empty if the heart isn't in it anymore. You find yourself wondering, why do I keep doing this? Do I still believe this the same way? Does this prayer still belong to me, or just to who I used to be? And that's when something beautiful, though a little unsettling, starts to happen. You begin to ask real questions. You stop just reciting the same words and begin looking for ones that feel true now. You start reaching for something deeper than routine, something that feels real. It can feel scary, especially when faith has always meant obedience and consistency. It can feel like you're doing something wrong by not going through the motions the way you used to. But here's what's true. Faith that matures must change, and part of growing older spiritually is realizing that your faith isn't something you inherit, or perform, or perfect. It's something you cultivate, personally, quietly, honestly. Now, prayer might sound less like, "Our Father who art in heaven," and more like, "Lord, I'm tired today." Be near. It might be less about showing up to a building and more about sitting on your porch, breathing in the sunrise and saying, "Thank you." You don't have to impress God. You don't have to prove yourself to Him. At this stage, in life, prayer isn't about performing your faith. It's about meeting God in your own voice, your own silence, your own way. That's not less faithful. That's more real. That's when prayer becomes not just what you were told to say, but who you are when no one's watching. There's a kind of loneliness that lives beneath the surface, not just from losing people, but from losing the way you used to feel spiritually connected. When you were younger, faith often came with community. A full church pew, friends in Deepening, Bible study. Someone beside you to nudge you during long sermons. Someone to hold your hand during prayer. But as the years pass, people start to go. Some move. Some grow distant. Some pass away. And slowly, the chorus that once surrounded your prayers becomes a solo whisper. Maybe you still go to church. Maybe you don't. Either way, you've likely felt the shift. Fewer familiar faces. Less energy. A new pastor who doesn't know your name. Music that doesn't stir your spirit the way the old hymns used to. Or maybe you're in a new place now. A retirement community, a smaller town, or a different state to be closer to your children, and the faith community you once knew is no longer within reach. And so prayer becomes something you do alone. It's just you and God. No choir, no altar, no fellowship lunch after the service. Just you and silence, and maybe a candle on the kitchen table. And sometimes that feels holy. But sometimes it just feels lonely. No one really prepares you for the spiritual solitude of old age. They talk about maintaining faith, but not about the isolation that can come with it. They talk about legacy, about wisdom, but not about missing the church family that used to know your story without needing you to retell it. And still, here you are, showing up. Maybe you don't pray like you used to, but something in you still turns toward God when the house is quiet. Something in you still aches for connection, not just to people but to something eternal. And maybe, just maybe, that loneliness is not a sign that your faith has weakened. Maybe it's proof that your heart is still reaching, not out of habit but out of hope. Even in the solitude, God is there. And in the quietest places, when no one else sees or hears you, He still does. For most of your life, you may have listened for God in the big moments. The passionate sermon that moved you to tears, the answer to a prayer that came just in time, the worship song that lifted your spirit, the clear yes or no that told you which way to go. But now the volume's different, the signs are quieter. The dramatic clarity you once longed for has been replaced with something less obvious, something slower, gentler, harder to name. And at first that can feel like God is farther away. But maybe He's closer than ever. Maybe it's just that He's speaking in a different language now, one you couldn't hear until you'd lived enough life to understand it. Because when you're in your 70s or 80s, God doesn't always come through lightning bolts or burning bushes. He comes in the breeze when you open the window, in the morning. He comes in the face of a grandchild who says something unexpectedly kind. He comes in the sudden wave of peace that finds you as you sip your tea alone. You start to realize that God isn't only in the sanctuary, He's in the silence. He's in the way the trees change color. He's in the memory that returns uninvited but somehow needed. He's in the tears that fall during a quiet moment when no one's watching but Him. After 70, the way God speaks might feel less like answers and more like presence. Not a God who always explains, but a God who sits beside you. Not a God who shouts commands, but one who whispers comfort. Not a God of urgency, but of abiding. You don't have to chase Him anymore. He's been walking with you this whole way. And now in this season, He speaks in the hush between moments, not to be hard to find, but to slow you down enough to really listen. And when you do, when you stop looking for fireworks and start paying attention to the flicker of his nearness, you'll find that he never stopped talking. You were just learning how to hear him in a whole new way. There's something deeply humbling about realizing that the way you used to pray no longer fits. Maybe it feels like your old prayer habits belong to a different version of you, one with more energy, more clarity, more certainty. Maybe your body can't kneel like it used to. Maybe your memory can't hold the verses word for word. Maybe the big, bold prayers you once prayed now feel too heavy to carry. And maybe that's okay, because prayer doesn't come with a rule book, and it doesn't come with an expiration date either. You can begin again. You can pray in your 70s, 80s, 90s, not like you did at 20 or 40, but in a way that is true for who you are now. Maybe prayer is just breathing deeply and whispering, "I'm still here, Lord." Maybe it's sitting in your chair with your hands open, saying nothing, but meaning everything. Maybe it's saying thank you when the sun hits the window just right. Maybe it's tears falling as you remember a friend you miss, and knowing God sees them too. You don't have to perform. You don't have to pretend. You don't even have to feel spiritual. You just have to be willing to show up, willing to speak or not speak, willing to let God meet you where you actually are, not where you think you're supposed to be. There's no shame in beginning again. In fact, it might be the holiest thing you've done all year. Because when you pray as you are now, weary, wise, imperfect, honest, you give God more than words. You give him access to your real heart, and that's all he's ever wanted. So if the old ways no longer fit, bless them. They served you. They brought you this far. But now, make room for something new, even if it's smaller, even if it's simpler, even if it's slower, because in this season, prayer is not about length, it's about presence, and presence is something you still have to give, even now. The world tends to treat aging like a slow fading, like you've already done the important work, like your best years are behind you, like you're winding down. But when it comes to faith, real, personal, soul-level faith, this might be the richest, most important chapter of all. Because when you're younger, faith is often about learning, about doing, about getting it right. But after 70, it's about knowing. It's about resting. It's about being known by God, not because of what you do, but because of who you are. At this stage, you've lived enough life to know that formulas don't always work, that prayers don't always get answered the way you expect, that spiritual highs don't last forever. But you've also learned what truly matters. And it's not performance. It's presence. It's not ritual. It's relationship. Faith now becomes less like a ladder to climb and more like a well to sit beside. You don't have to prove anything anymore. You don't have to strive for gold stars or spiritual achievements. You just get to be, to sit quietly in your chair with your tea, your aches, your memories, and know that God is there with you, not demanding, not grading, just staying. This is the deepening. When you start to realize that God's not interested in the version of you that looks holy. He's interested in you, the one who's lived, the one who's lost, the one who's laughed and failed and tried again, the one who keeps showing up, even when the words don't come, even when the prayers feel flat, even when you're not sure what you believe in the same way anymore. This season is not less spiritual. It's more honest. It's slower, yes, but it's also truer, because the older you get, the more space you have to let go of everything that wasn't real and hold on to everything that is. You are not at the end of your faith story. You are in the deep water now, and even here, even now, God is not finished with you. If your prayers have gone quiet, if your faith feels smaller than it used to, if you wonder whether God still hears you, let this be a reminder. He does. He always has. Not because your prayers were perfect, not because you always felt close, but because He never left. You may have changed. You may have wandered. You may have gone silent for days or weeks or even years, but you are not lost to Him. You never have been. Sometimes, the faith that looks like silence is actually sacred. Sometimes the letting go of old routines is the beginning of something real. Sometimes the smallest prayer, whispered with tired lips, carries the most weight. You don't have to pray like you used to. You don't have to be who you were. You just have to be you. Right here. Right now. Still breathing. Still hoping. Still loved. And somewhere in the quiet of your heart, you already know this. You haven't forgotten him. Not really. Not in the mornings when the light hits just right. Not in the tears you cried without knowing why. Not in the moments when you looked up at the sky and said nothing, but meant everything. He's still here, and so are you. So begin again, not with pressure, but with permission. To pray like yourself. To believe like it matters. To rest in a God who never stopped waiting for you to speak, and who never stopped speaking to you even now, especially now.